He's a trustee of the Association for Learning Technology, which supports professional and policy development for staff using educational technology. He's an advocate in pedagogical change and community development, engagement in education and creative industries, and he co-leads the Future Happens initiative, which uses innovative approaches to problem solving and change management to engage the wider higher education sector in critical conversations and research-informed conversations about technology, pedagogy, and the future of the modern university. He's produced a number of award-winning podcasts and also some blogs. I'd particularly encourage you to look at his blog, Post Digital Learning, which I think we can probably put a link up to during the day. And when I was reading this, I realized that, Peter, you have a passion, a real passion for music, including indie, garage, and what you describe as weird outside music. I don't have a clue what that is, but it sounds very pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you and hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And I think I could take up an entire keynote explaining what outsider music is, so I will avoid the joy that might be. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm really quite excited to share some of the work that we've been doing here at the University of Sydney, much of which is actually developed over a number of years in not just the work at Sydney, but also the work that in my previous institutions in the UK pre-COVID times. And I've called this about a presentation being a part of our place in a disrupted world. And you'll see where the notion of our place fits in a little bit later in the talk. And it is going to focus on not just the experiences that we've had during the pandemic, but how we exit, when we do exit that, into our never normal world. I'm quite happy if you want to, I'll put my email address at the end. I'm more than happy to have any engagement with people via email. And of course, I'm an avid Twitter person. So if you've got a Twitter account, I'm happy for you to @ me at that as well. As part of something that is actually an important part of being a presenter here in Australia, we always acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are on. And I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands I work and live on. And the University of Sydney itself is built on a hill, which is an intersection of 3 roads, where all of the peoples in the Sydney Basin have come together as a hill and site of learning for 40,000 years. And we are strongly connected to the Indigenous communities, not just in Australia, but in our local area, in our university, which is a strongly Indigenous part of Sydney. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, who have sort of cared for and continue to care for the country that I live in. So let me tell you a little bit about the University of Sydney. We are Australia's oldest university. We've been around for around 170 years. As I mentioned before, we are built on Gadigal land at the intersection of 3 roads where the peoples came together to learn. We have about 70,000 students at the university, so we're quite a large university. For what it's worth, we are a global top 50 university in most of the rankings, and I will allow you to judge whether that's an important or not important statistic. And the mantra of the university is about leadership for good. We are a broad church of a university. We have 5 faculties and 2 university schools, and we teach everything from classical composition in our conservatorium, through to medicine, through to engineering, through to business, through to arts and social science. We have the whole gamut. Hence, that's why we have 70,000 students. The business school that I am a part of has about 16,500 of those students. Around 68% of them are international, and a sizable proportion of those international students, around 91%, are from China. For a business school, and I know Trinity has business school, we have the 3 major accreditations of the business school, what they call the Triple Crown: which is AACSB, Equus and Amber. We run 8 disciplines, so we cross most of the standard business disciplines. We are highly leveraged. What that means is that we generally don't have the luxury of small classes. Most of our classes are large. We run at scale in almost everything we do. Our largest units are around 2,300 students, and our average size sits at around 550. And most of those exist in 2 very large programs, our Master of Commerce, which is the largest postgraduate qualification in the Southern Hemisphere, and our Bachelor of Commerce, which is our entry-level business qualification. So it's a big school. That photo is of our building, the H70, the Abercrombie building, which has been, like most university buildings, laying fallow for most of the last 2 years, but with small signs of life as we enter into summer, and then we shut down for the summer holidays. What I want to talk about here is how have the pandemic years of universities fractured some of our futures? And I'll use the University of Sydney Business School as the kind of lens to look at that through, but it's not exclusively about us. We are no different to any other university. We have got the same challenges that the pandemic has brought upon us, the same weaknesses that the pandemic has exposed, and the same strengths that the pandemic has shown us we had and probably perhaps didn't know that we did. But it has fractured both the futures of students and staff. And I just want to sort of dig into that a little bit. One too far. So let's talk about the students. We asked our students all the way through the pandemic what was impacting on their learning. So the way it happened here in Sydney, in January 2020, we got the first indications that there was a virus emerging out of Wuhan in China, where around about 8% of our students were from, and about 4% of our students were currently in China for the Lunar New Year ceremony. And Australia shut its borders to Wuhan, then to China fairly rapidly in January. And we moved into full online learning in week 3 of the first semester, knowing that Australia runs a January to December academic year, as opposed to an August to July. So we started talking to our students really early about how they were feeling, knowing that over 50% of our undergraduate and 80% of our postgraduate students were stuck overseas. We wanted to know what their experiences were. And we really wanted them to tell us those experiences in the form of stories. So not in a survey or a set of multiple choice questions, but through their stories, what they were experiencing and how much the university sort of perspective about leadership meant to them in an environment of crisis, and how that impacted their sense of belonging at the university. So one of the things we did was we asked them to share with us photos, videos, artifacts of the spaces they were learning in, and those photos are 3 of those artifacts that were shared with us. This is from a video which two students produced, and it's about how they felt so lonely in the residence halls. So these 2 students weren't stuck overseas; they were trapped here in Australia, but couldn't go home. And they were one of the few students in the residence halls left. And the student on the right was really struggling with motivation. And he had this wonderful sad part of his video where he was playing table tennis with nobody. He just served a table tennis ball and the ball just dribbled off the table at the end. And they shared how much they felt isolated, how much they felt unsafe, how much they felt uncertain. And what did they do to cope? Because their dining rooms, their bedrooms, their hallways became their lecture theatres. And that was a really difficult transition for them. So for them to share those spaces with people, to share their rites of passage, and to share the liminal journeys they were going on, that uncertainty they were feeling, was quite exposing for the students, but it was really, really valuable. Because what it then afforded us the opportunity to do was to understand their experiences of learning better. And it helped us shape some of the work that we do. This is an example of a podcast that has just finished its first cycle of 6 episodes called Collab, part of our Work, Live, Play, Learn program, which is a long-standing student voice project. And we asked students to both make the podcast, be guests on the podcast, and then through a Padlet, share their own insights about what the podcast was discussing. These 6 episodes have been listened to thousands of times by students inside the business school, and we have received nearly 300 small posts like the ones on the slide on Padlet. And the core messages we really wanted to tap into here, which were about what it was like to be an international student in a time of a pandemic, how were they coping, how were they engaging and socializing. Those things were fed in through these conversations we had with students about how fractured their experiences were, because we wanted to create an environment in which they were not necessarily feeling as uncertain. Or if they were, they would at least find others who were feeling uncertain and they could get a sense of community from that. We also wanted to ask our teachers, because asking teachers is a pretty important part of this as well. And the real challenges that our teachers told us in that similar methodology of trying to ask their stories and sharing their experiences was that they felt that their identity was being challenged. Now, how much of that identity was formed by the spaces they were in, how much of that identity was formed by habitual or established practice of teaching was a really interesting thing for us to probe. But it really did show that for a lot of the teachers, and this is an example of some of my teaching colleagues in the business school, for a lot of them, they felt the online teaching experience as far back as 2020, right through into this semester, challenged their identity as teachers. On the other hand, they actually felt they were part of something. They felt that this reaction to crisis, this engagement with the challenges of the crisis made them feel like they were part of a teaching community. And that sense of community really grew over the course of the 2 years. And without a doubt, they were entirely willing to share their practices with everybody. And they did that through our blog, which was mentioned before, what's called the Co-Design Research blog. We have got a collection of resources and activities and capabilities to engage. And this is just a small front slide of some of the resources that we put together for staff and students to engage online. We have about 287 full-time faculty, about 1,000 casuals, and our current numbers engaged in both the team site and in the Canvas site are well over 600, which is an amazing community of people coming together. But both of those were not what would have been the case had 2019 become 2020 without the pandemic. They were very different experiences. And for us, with all of the stuff that we offered our staff, with all of the opportunities we had for them to share, with all of the opportunities that we gave for them to be in front of others as experienced practitioners or sharing their fears and their concerns and their lessons learned, for all of that, it still left us with the feeling that what we were doing was reacting to a crisis. That all we were doing was we had a circumstance put in front of us and we reacted. Now, in 2020, we talked a lot as a sector about this becoming emergency response teaching, not online teaching. At the university itself refused to refer to it as online teaching. It was remote teaching, and our students were remote from us. And as a school, where 80% of our postgraduate and 50% of our undergraduate students were not on campus, to just dismiss their experiences as remote and create an experience that was just almost like a recording of what they were missing out on, we didn't feel was a particularly fair way to engage with them. And it was really important for me, particularly because the students talked about this. How did we overcome their sense of isolation? How did we overcome that sense that they were missing out on something and that they were able to gain some of the benefits that a higher education experience offers them, which is the building of a network? So we've always approached our development of teaching and learning in the business school, and it's something that's very, it's built around my practice as the Associate Dean, is we've always built things in a very complex way. And part of that is, with 16,500 students, we are not, we're not homogeneous. You know, the students are all very different. They're coming from different disciplinary backgrounds. If you're a quantitative person versus a qualitative person, you know, all students from China are not the same. There's a very different set of expectations and personalities and objectives for studying. And, you know, of course, every person is an individual and every person is different. So we build very complex ecosystems of teaching and learning. And I want to take you through two of them today as examples of things that we did, drawing on all that sort of fractured nature of the student experience and a fractured nature of the staff experience. Now, one of these was something that we'd started prior to the pandemic, and when the pandemic hit, it was the perfect thing to have in place. And the other was a ecosystem we designed during the pandemic. So what do I mean when I'm talking about teaching and learning ecosystems? I'm talking about complex and interactive networks of activity that help us interact with the widest span of the community in addressing pedagogical challenges. It is almost the opposite of the one-size-fits-all. This is about trying to find different ways in which people can come into a change process. Because if we take a top-down approach to this, which is fine, you can have the dean or the vice-chancellor or the provost, whoever say, we're all going to do this. That will take people along a certain distance, but only so far. It will probably take people to the sort of minimum required standard. If you expect bottom-up, where people will just do things out of the enthusiasm for the particular change that you need to make, yes, you'll get the advocates and the zealots and the people who are passionately committed to it. But then you struggle as you start to try and move that change through the broader faculty. So the idea of a teaching and learning ecosystem is that you have multiple ways in which people can engage in change. So there isn't a top-down or a bottom-up. There's just multiple ways they can engage. And yes, it is a lot like spinning plates, because in order to have these kind of ecosystems working, you've got to have multiple things happening at once. And I'll show you in a very brief way what some of those might be. So let me talk about our first one. Our first one is called Connected Learning at Scale. This did start prior to the pandemic, and it was a project that the university funded to help us deal with the fact that we had experienced a 47% increase in student numbers between 2014 and 2019. And that continued on even during the pandemic, where we had a 16% increase in students in semester 2 2020, which was the second half of last year. And what was happening is our units were crumbling under the stress of this. So we came up with this idea of a project that would redesign units to not just cope with scale, but to actually be designed for it. And it was a very complex approach to connected learning. So the idea, if anyone has ever seen the work of George Siemens and Stephen Downes, was that students learnt by building connections. They learnt by drawing their connections from outside of their university experience into their university connections. And instead of just simply looking at this as the connections of people, we were looking at connections both as a people connection through the students, but the discipline connection, the knowledges and skills that were resident in the programs that they were studying, the societal connections, the communities they were members of, the work they were doing, the families they'd come from, and the wider university community. and building connections with all of those things. Now, I won't go through this. This is more indicative and exemplar. I'm more than happy for Trinity to share these slides with everybody so you can sort of dig into some of the depth that's here. But the simple message is we were looking at multiple ways people could connect rather than forcing people to connect via a gathering or a club. There were multiple ways. If you wanted to connect through connected learning at scale, you might actually just find your connections by connecting to a discipline that you're really interested in. So as I said, it's a university strategic project. It was designing for teaching and learning experiences for scale, not just to cope with it. It commenced in 2019. And at this stage, we've transformed 50 of our 280 units, and it has impacted 90% of the business school cohort. And the project is about delivering a truly transformative and globally leading business education. So it's more than just a kind of layer, a sort of a glossy layer approach. It is fundamentally transforming the student and teaching experience. It's built on 3 principles, which are looking at information engagement, the way students consume information, the lecture in very broad terms, connected participation and active learning, a classroom experience, and changing how they actually engage in the classroom, the common parlance of authentic assessment, but building in real opportunities, not just for feedback, but for feed forward. And the most critical thing is in a business school, we really wanted the students to be able to not do this in the context of, a hypothetical ABC plumbing or, Bob's filing services. We really wanted this to be in the context of real life, critical, global, local, and personal challenges. So the information was provided through that lens. The connected learning in the class, the connected and active learning in the class is provided through that. And then the assessment was connected to that. And one really simple example was a unit that we taught is introductory statistics, which used to just take a data set of building widgets. And over the last 2 years, they've been doing data sets of trying to use statistical analysis to understand how fast the growth of plastics being left in the Pacific Ocean is growing, and how much effort would be required using statistical techniques to how fast they could actually be removed. Now, that's real data to a real problem, and it opens up for 1,500 students a completely different context they'd never thought about, and much more interesting and much more relevant to them than widgets. As I mentioned before, it is a very complex intersection of things that we're doing. And I won't go through these. This is just to show that in each of the principles, so principle 1, transforming the lecture, we're doing lots of different stuff with different academics for different units to try and deliver the connected learning at scale principle. Because once again, the critical message for us here is we are not trying to reach a minimum standard. We're not trying to make everyone fit a pedagogical pattern. We are looking at different ways that are appropriate to the teachers, to the needs of the student, to the type of unit that they're in, and the type of learning that is appropriate to transform this particular unit of study. And for us, that is the spinning plates in the air thing. Because if we're transforming 50 units as we did last year, that means we might have 30 or 40 different pedagogical transformation projects running at once. And whilst there is common learning from that, we are applying common principles, we are applying, it's a common discipline area, it's all in business. It still means that each one we are approaching with a real sense of uniqueness and a real sense of customization. So I want to take you through one of these really quickly, and that's the notion of transforming the lecture. Everybody has shifted over the last 2 years to an online lecture. We've all done it in very different ways. One of the things that we've been really keen to do is break the online lecture up into chunks, which is once again reasonably common. We have tried to shape that experience so that students have agency over their navigation of that lecture. So you can see in the middle part of that slide there, we've produced 8 videos around a particular topic, which is industry leaders reflecting on their leadership legacy. And we say to students, watch at least 3. You can choose which ones you're interested in. We bring in multitude different voices. So in the case of the first picture there with the lots of different faces, they are all the people who participated in the delivery of a single unit. We had nearly 50 people provide voice in a single 3-hour-a-week unit with a 1-hour lecture. And the idea of that was to bring in different perspectives so that it wasn't just a single voice, that it was multiple voices with student agency over the choice of those voices. And it allowed students to, for example, say with Tash there at the end, Tash appeared in about 5 weeks. Now, if they liked what Tash had to say, they could follow Tash all the way through the 5 weeks. They may have only watched her for one of those 5 weeks, but we wanted to give students agency. And the final part of this, and for those of you who are tech people will note, there are, particularly on the section here, opportunities for this to be interactive. Using H5P and HTML5 coding, we encouraged every one of these videos to be interactive, to allow students to, in an asynchronous way, try and ape synchronous interactivity, whether that be through using things like Padlet, whether that be using things like polling tools. But the idea was to allow students the opportunity to interact. So what we really were trying to do is move lectures from this repeated broadcast, static, distant and traditional. And that's one of our lecture theatres. We all know what that looks like in a lecture theatre. To being chunked, interactive, having strong reference to digital stories, using different forms of media, and so not just video, using podcasts, using pencasts, using a whole variety of media. And really importantly, we wanted it to be DIY. We didn't want this to be all done in a studio. We didn't want lecture recording. We wanted people to do DIY, and we provided our staff with DIY kits and capabilities to learn how to do it themselves, to give it a go, to fail if it didn't work and learn how to make it better, and provide at elbow support where possible. And you can see some of the examples of that. The second thing we looked at was space, because one of the real challenges of an online environment that can flip, and in semester 1, we did flip back to having a very hybridized environment. We had about half our students on campus and half off, was how much space dictated what we were doing. And we developed an approach which we've called space agnostic learning, and it's trying to work out how we can break space to not be the thing that dictates the experience of the people in it. Now, that sounds slightly overdramatic, but the intention of this is knowing that over half our students will not be back in the country, and there's still no sign of how we're going to get them back in the country because our borders are still closed for non-Australian citizens. We expect them to be open sometime next year, but we don't know when. But we want the students in the online space and in the physical space to have the same equivalent experience, to be able to experience learning and group work in the same way. So we've done a lot of work trying to design spaces that we can do that kind of work in. And you can see some of the sort of design work we've started to do, which is all about how we can bring students together in a space with their colleagues in an online space and have the class happen in a sequential time. So rather than having a remote class or an online class here at 10 to 12, and at 12 to 2, you have your face-to-face class. The idea is that they are all in the same space and try and address some of the challenges that high flex learning has, which is always, and there are many people who refer to high flex learning as the worst of both worlds, that it doesn't really deliver the best parts of a face-to-face experience or the best parts of an online experience. But we're trying to do it the other way around. And I have got a blog post on the CDRG blog, which I'm happy to share, which explains some of this process of space agnostic learning. But the core bit of it for us is, how do we design for an experience where everybody gets to engage with each other and have an equivalent learning experience? The second ecosystem I want to talk about is one that actually happened while we're on COVID, and that was a program we called Leading in a Post-Crisis World. It was built on the idea that many of our students were suspending their studies in the hope that perhaps they'd be able to come back to campus. And we had nearly 27% of our students suspend in semester 1, 2020. That does create real problems, not just for the financial stability of the institution, but actually provide real problems for student progression, real problems for student motivation and engagement, and particularly for retention and achievement. So the aim of Leading in a Post-Crisis World was to develop a program that would build in both an extra and curricular aspect where students could actually build their connections. It would be unique to the University of Sydney Business School. It would be a real opportunity for them to sort of understand their story in a post-crisis world and in a job market that had been completely transformed and completely fractured by the pandemic. It is a series of extra and intercurricular learning opportunities. It empowers students to solve future challenges in collaboration with their peers, world-class academics and industry leaders. They were designed to make connections, leverage partnerships and form networks, and develop their capabilities and narratives, their story as leaders for good. Another complex ecosystem of activity, which I won't explain the drawing here is to show the complexity of it, but basically students undertook units, they did seminars, they were involved in a thing called Research Connections, which is where they were making connections with some of the critical cutting edge research being done at the university. They were able to engage in a project called Future Makers, where 1,800 of them came collectively together to crowdsource solutions to critical global local challenges, such as violence against women, such as vaccine hesitancy and climate change. And collectively, those 1,800 students developed plans that were shared with industry, shared with the community, and shared with government to get feedback on their solutions to those unsolvable challenges. I'll jump past this one. This just explains that it's a very, this is part of that complexity model. The most important part for us was that it was about celebrating the diverse voices of the community of the university. Academic, employer and industry, alumni, students, and the community. And we had everyone from the the New South Wales CEO of KPMG through to the dude who makes coffee in the coffee shop round the corner, who did his interviews in his overalls and no shirt. It was probably the single most Australian thing I'd seen in 2 years. And, you know, we wanted that diversity of voices to be there. We wanted that diversity of voices to be the thing that helped students understand their experience, both through learning in a unit and just through engaging in webinars and in sessions and in workshops and in things that didn't contribute to credit-bearing programs. They did heaps of different stuff. As you can see here, we gave them agency over how they navigated their way through. We asked them to, for example, share their experiences of the pandemic through a book cover. And this is just an example of some of the books, everything from 1984 right through to No Longer Human. We had hundreds of these book covers that students shared with each other. We gave them opportunities to navigate through content. Some of this is from the unit. The top slides are from the unit. The bottom slides are from some of the workshop activities that they did outside of the units of study. We gave them an opportunity to solve global, local, and personal challenges. And we've just had the forum where they share those. And the one that was that won was about preventing domestic violence to women in Chinese households. And it was a stunning piece of leadership from these students to share their own experiences of this and their families' experiences, and then to share their solutions, not just their economic and commercial, but share their own personal solutions. And these are an example of some of the other ones that we had them to that they chose to look at themselves. So what have we learned from designing these big ecosystems? It's important that we design for multiple entry points, different speeds of learning, and varied pathways through learning. None of these are dictated. This gives the staff and students opportunities to come in wherever they feel comfortable. It allowed us to create ecosystems that intersect, build dependencies, and encourage engagement. I'm not frightened of dependencies. We often make dependencies a phrase that we shy away from. There are dependencies in here. By doing something that intersects with something else, and that means that you are dependent on working with and connecting with someone else. That, I think, is powerful. We incorporated visual rhetoric and digital storytelling as a core element of this because we didn't just want this to be built around a standard academic model. And both visual rhetoric and digital storytelling are skills students can take with them. They're very powerful tools at interview. They're very powerful tools in their first job, and they will be equally as powerful in their 9th or 10th job. As I mentioned, we were really keen to embrace the affordances of the fact that our students were spread around the world and on campus. And it was a critical part of this for us to build a connected learning community. Our students have told us time and time again they feel disconnected from the university. They feel not part of the learning community. Aside from the absolute social tragedy that actually is, it impacts on the students' long-term engagement in the university. It impacts on the students' lifelong passion for lifelong learning. And if we get it wrong once, some students will never come back to this again. So it's really important to build that. So to wrap this up, one of our biggest challenges as a sector in 2022 now is to avoid what I call the snapback. The snapback is the desire that many of us and our colleagues have to go back to what we had in 2019, to go back to the big lecture, to go back to pen and paper exams, to go back to workshops where we just chatted for a while and we gave students a bit of pen and paper and we came back with some answers and that was done. There is a real set of learnings that have come from this experience. How do we make sure that we don't snap back and that we actually take from these pandemic years what is actually valuable to us as a sector? How do we resist the notion that this is always going to be the never normal, that we are going to be in constant cycles of change? I was talking to someone today about micro-credentials at our own teaching and learning conference. And I expressed the idea that really that's exactly the same as the same promises we were being given by MOOCs 10 years ago. And it was probably the same promise we were given by online learning 10 years before that. And this idea that we're going to be in this constant cycle of change is not good for the well-being of staff. It's not good for the well-being of students. It is something that we need to find the things that work and give us comfort. And we need to learn from the crisis. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. This is my email address. I would love to hear from people. That is my Twitter handle. And the site down there is my blog that was mentioned at the start, which is Post-Digital Learning. That's where I keep a lot of my sort of thought pieces on higher education and how that intersects with the glorious world that is Australian independent and alternative music and the aforementioned outsider music. So thank you very much.